Hello, my name is Cedric Chippendale. In May of 2022, a young man by the name of Salvador Ramos, who was 18 years old at the time, walked into Robb Elementary School at Uvalde, Texas, and armed with a semi-automatic rifle, began to randomly shoot at the students who were attending. The police was called and the officers arrived on scene, and they decided to barricade the classroom in which this young man was held up in and wait. They waited for additional equipment to arrive, and after that, they would then rush or storm the classroom and then neutralize the situation. However, in the in between time, while waiting for the equipment to arrive, Ramos shot and killed 18 more people, including two teachers. The report that followed said there was a fatal delay in waiting for additional equipment to arrive, and lives would have been saved had the officers acted promptly and neutralized the situation. Ramos was eventually killed in the shootout with police. And in the aftermath of this tragic and horrific situation, it was determined that the delay that happened as the officers were waiting for additional equipment was fatal for those who were held up inside the classroom. Thus, it was described as a fatal delay. When we come to our story in Mark chapter 5, we find there was also a fatal delay. The lady with the bleeding issue came up behind Jesus from within the crowd and grabbed hold of his garment, in which she immediately received release and relief from her condition. Jesus did not continue on his way to the home of Jairus because his daughter was fatally ill. Instead, he stood still. He looked around at the crowd and wanted to know who touched his garment. It was a different kind of touch as opposed to the others who were pressing against him, in that it was a touch that was faith-filled. The lady who tried to hide, maybe in fear that she contaminated him because of her condition, stepped forward, and Jesus spent some time with her, where he affirmed her isolation has ended, where he calls her his daughter or daughter, where he affirms that her condition is now permanently solved, and he made sure that she understood that there was no power in his garment, thus creating some form of superstition, but rather that the power came from him and not from the clothes that he was wearing. And in the in-between time, between him as he was dialoguing with this woman and waiting, as it were, Jairus waiting for Jesus to get a move on, Jairus gets interrupted by a group of a delegation from his home, which said to him in verse 35 that while he was still speaking, people from the synagogue's leader's house came, saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" And so what they told Jairus is that she no longer need any help. That this young woman, the 12-year-old girl, was not at the point of death. Rather, she had died. And now it was too late for Jesus to come and do something. The situation is such, according to them, that even the teacher, whom they described Jesus as, could not help. The original readers in Mark know, as they were reading this, reading this account, knew, because of what they have read so far, that no situation is hopeless when Jesus is involved. He is the Son of God. He who possessed mastery over the nature, who possessed mastery over illness and mastery over demons, as long as he's in the situation, is not hopeless. And they themselves find themselves, the original readers, in a situation where they were being persecuted and pressured by the authorities of the day. And they had to know, had to learn that their continual trust in Jesus will always produce positive results. And in this case, they knew what Jairus didn't know, and what the messengers that brought the message to Jairus, that even though the girl was dead, and even though she had succumbed to her illness, Jesus is still involved in the picture, and therefore the situation is not hopeless. And so Mark, having described the hopelessness of the disciples in the storm in Mark chapter 4 verse 38, Master, do you not care that we perish? He just described the hopelessness of the demoniac who turned to Jesus even though he was tormented by the amount of demons that was occupying his body. And fresh in the memory would be the hemorrhaging woman who was in a hopeless situation in that she had no one to intercede for her, found hope by touching the garment of Jesus. And now Mark focus our attention on the total hopelessness of Jairus' situation. The child is not sick. The 12-year-old girl is not sick. The 12-year-old girl is no longer at the point of death. She has died. And now it's too late. That not even the teacher can help. Jesus overhears the situation, overhears the message, and turns to Jairus to encourage him. And he says to Jairus, do not fear, but only believe. And so, in spite of the news or the tragedy that the news contained from his home, Jesus tells his followers, and specific for Jairus, to continue to believe in Jesus Christ. Do not be afraid, but continue to place his confidence in Christ. Now, in the Gospels, we learn that fear and faith cannot coexist. It is like water mixed with oil. And so you're either afraid or you're either full of faith, or you have placed your full faith in Jesus Christ. And so what Mark tells us is Jesus reassures his followers, including Jairus, particularly Jairus, to continue to place his confidence in God. And for Mark to place your confidence or place your faith in God or in Jesus, it's the same thing. And so what Jesus was telling Jairus is that in respect to your daughter's circumstances, your future, this tragedy that you have experienced is closed. But with respect to Jesus, the future is still open. Because faith is not something that Jairus has, but faith is something that carries Jairus. And so what Jesus was telling Jairus, and through Jairus to us, is that fear will destroy our faith, but at the same time, faith will drive out fear. And so what Jesus is telling Jairus is continue to place your confidence in me, because it will carry you from despair to hope. And so Jesus' authoritative word to Jairus is not to fear, but to believe. So the phrase, stop fearing, just keep on believing, Jesus is encouraging the disciples and Jairus, is that you, Jairus, has already exercised faith in coming to me. You have seen the relationship between faith and the power of Jesus by this woman who grabbed hold of his garment. And now he says to Jairus, continue to believe because he could and he will restore his lifeless daughter back to life. And so we read in verses 38 to 39 that Jesus dismisses the crowd and he took 3 disciples along with him, the three. And these 3 disciples, who were Peter, James, and John, who would accompany Jesus to the house of Jairus as his witnesses. Only Peter and James and John were, and the mother of the child were allowed to accompany Jesus to the dead girl's side. And so the miracle that Jesus is going to do, the supreme miracle in raising someone from the dead, would only be for their eyes only. As they approached the house, as they approached the house, they could hear the dancing of the mourners as a commentary for the world around them to know that death has happened in that society. In those days, obviously, they didn't have social media, and so they could not announce someone's passing, but by the loud noise of the mourning, the people then would know that there has been tragedy in the community, and they would make their way home, and they would make their way to the community. And so the mourning, the crying, the dancing, the singing would highlight the desperate and hopeless situation that Jairus' family finds themselves in. Jesus enters into the scene and says to the attendees there, he said, why are you weeping? For the girl is not dead. Okay, then I must go. Upon entering into the house of the synagogue leader, Jesus sees the confusion and the weeping and the noise, and he talks very loudly and asks the question to everyone present there in verse 39. Why are you distressed and weeping? For the child is not dead, but asleep. And so what Jesus is doing is that he is using a metaphor of sleep in the New Testament. Is often the metaphor of sleep is often used in the New Testament to describe death. And so from the perspective of our Lord is that she's experiencing death, but it will be so short that it can be compared to sleep. And so he's saying, what I'm about to do is I'm about to resurrect this girl, restore this girl to life, and the experience that she has of dying will be equal to as if she has taken a short nap. The mourners around began to mock him and ridicule him, for they know the girl is not literally sleeping. They know that the girl is dead, and so Jesus' use Jesus' use of the term, the girl is asleep, for them it's absolutely absurd. And so they began to mock and ridicule him, which serves as a proof that their mourning was not genuine. And so they did not believe in Jesus. They did not believe, they thought that he was out of his mind. And so they mocked him, and with a loud voice, Jesus chased them out, and they leave the house. And so Jesus walks into the room where the girl was laying in a death sleep, as it were, and he calls out to her and says, little girl, arise. and immediately the girl wakes up, and the girl, a spirit returns according to the Gospel of Luke. She awakes, and Jesus instructs the parents to feed her. The others who were around, the disciples, were amazed because they stood in the presence of death, and God, through Jesus Christ, has overcome this obstacle of death. And so, in this episode of raising this girl from the dead, Jesus is proving that he had conquered two enemies. The one enemy was unbelief, which was the problem that Jarius had, the problem which the attendees of the funeral had, and the other one was he was able to overcome the enemy of death. What Mark has done here is that he took the two episodes, the one of the lady with the bleeding disorder, and the one of the 12-year-old girl who died because of her illness, and yet she was restored to life. Mark has taken these two stories and episodes and began to emphasize the greatness of the Son of God. He had shown in chapter 4, verse 35 to 43, that Jesus is Lord over nature. In chapter 5, verses 1 to 20, that Jesus is Lord over the demons. And now he continues with this lordship of the Son of God by showing us that Jesus, by healing the hemorrhaging lady, that Jesus is Lord and Master over illness. And now climatically, in the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter, that Jesus is Lord of even death itself. It goes back to the question that is asked in Mark chapter 4, verse 41. Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? And the answer to this question that is asked in verse 41 of chapter 4 is answered by the confession of the demons in chapter 5, verse 7. Jesus is the Son of the Most High. The disciples who were in chapter 4, verse 40, was criticized or rebuked by Jesus because of the lack of faith. The demoniac shows that by coming to Jesus, he is delivered from his torment. The woman with the bleeding issue is commended for her faith. The Jairus is urged not to lose faith. And so what is clear, what Mark is doing here is emphasizing the importance of faith. Faith is based on the greatness of the one in whom they have placed their confidence. This Jesus in whom they believe is worthy of their confidence, for he is Lord over nature, he is Lord over demons, he is Lord over illness, and ultimately he is Lord over death. What need they fear if they're going to remain faithful to him? In the light of their knowing that the Son of God has saved them and continue to do so, he will raise them from the dead. Okay, I'm going to take that out.